Here they are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Imagine trying to do something like multiplication with Roman numerals. Once the numbers get above a certain amount, they are ridiculously unwieldy. This new, agile numerical system made everyday things like bookkeeping and accounting more accessible. Mathematics developed, and the construction of complex architectural projects became much easier. Recently, archaeologists renovating the roof timbers of Salisbury Cathedral in England made a discovery which clarifies this story.
On some of the beams that support the roof, there are a series of numbers that were carved in around 1200 AD when the cathedral was built. Now, that's a 3, and obviously it's familiar to us today, but in its time, it was a curious and progressive symbol.
At this time, everyone in England was still using the clunky old Roman numerals, but here in the rafters of one cathedral, a new trend appears to have caught on.
These numbers, the numbers that we use today, the fact that they're here is proof that the ordinary craftsmen who carved them benefited from an explosion of knowledge that started in Arabia and spread through Europe via Islamic Spain.
And the travellers from Toledo brought more than just practical knowledge back to England.
After a number of years, Daniel of Morley returned from Toledo, his cases crammed with documents and volumes. And when he arrived in England, he made an appointment to hand this precious booty over to his patron, who was a bishop. This benefactor was one of a team of scholars who wanted to establish their town as a centre of learning. And the name of the town was Oxford.
The universities that were founded in Paris, Bologna and Oxford at this time based their new curriculum on the radical ideas which were pouring out of Toledo.
One of Daniel of Morley's compatriots, a man called Adelard of Bath, published this volume just after he got back from Toledo. It's a collection of 76 very basic questions, like why is the sea salty? Why are there tides? How does the globe hang in the air? And do animals have souls? The questions are seemingly simple, but they embody a new spirit of rational inquiry, where a blind faith in God is challenged. And Adelard of Bath admits his debt to the Muslims in pursuing this line of inquiry. He writes, "From the Arabs I have learnt one thing, to lead by reason. I will detract nothing from God, but very carefully listen to the limits of human knowledge. Only where this utterly breaks down should we refer things to God."
The Muslims developed a massive program of translations in which they translated from Greek into Arabic everything that had reached them. And this was something that was promoted by the whole society. And the result of this is that they translated practically all Greek knowledge. There is a first period in which they translate and they learn, they assimilate. Later, they had learned enough and they began to produce original works by themselves and to criticize Greek science. And of course, one cannot say that the Arabs were mere transmitters of Greek science. They were the people that continued the work of Greek scientists until they led all this research into a final crisis. And this final crisis was the crisis that brought the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. If they had not done this, Renaissance and scientific revolution would have been impossible.
It would take time for these groundbreaking ideas to become assimilated into Christian Europe. But once they were, Western intellect was transformed. The works of Aristotle were taught in the new universities. The medical treatises of Avicenna were used in hospitals. And Arabic translations of Greek geometry and those new Arabic numerals were passed on to craftsmen and architects. This was a critical stage in the growth of Western thought. We should no longer see the Renaissance as a rebirth, but the continuation of an intellectual movement which had been nourished centuries earlier by Muslims.
The Italian Renaissance is famous for reviving classical learning, but in fact what's happening here 400 years earlier seems to be just as vital. Do you think that Muslim scholars aren't given due credit for what they're doing in Islamic Spain at this time?
It is not something that you would learn about in school, probably, or even at university. It was probably conscious process of neglect, and now we are still suffering from that.
Extremely selective history writing.
That's right. It is due to the conflict that existed between the two worlds.
These remarkable ideas were leaching out of Al-Andalus at precisely the same time that the Christians were flooding in. The frontier, which had started far north of Madrid, was gradually pushing southwards. Then, in 1236, Cordoba fell, followed by Valencia and Seville, until by 1250, only the Kingdom of Granada remained Muslim. From now on, Spain would concentrate on cleaning the Muslim presence from its country.
The Islamic influence on Europe has been quietly laid down, but when it came to the physical expulsion of the Muslims from Spain, that would be an act that was anything but subtle. It was shocking and absolute.
The history of Al-Andalus was about to take a new and sinister turn. In the city of Granada, the Muslims were to fall victim to one of the most shocking acts of ethnic cleansing that Europe has ever seen.
Long after the rest of Al-Andalus had fallen to the Christians, Granada remained defiantly Islamic. Protected by mountains and those giant watchtowers and forts, the 70,000 Muslims who lived here managed to hold off attack for another 200 years. But time was running out.
While Granada occupied a small territory in the south of Spain, the rest of the country was now divided between Castile in the west and Aragon in the east, two very powerful kingdoms. The King of Castile was about to be forced to pass his kingdom to his niece, Isabella.
Isabella was headstrong and passionate, but she also had an acute political mind. In 1469, at the age of 18, she married her second cousin, Ferdinand, the dashing heir to the throne of Aragon. Now, the two most powerful Catholic dynasties in Spain were united, and the reconquest was edging ever closer to completion.
Granada was blocking Isabella's vision of a unified Spain, and so it had to be reclaimed. The city was laid to siege for a year before it finally surrendered.
On the 1st of January 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella, dressed in elaborate Moorish outfits, which they'd had especially made. With great pomp and circumstance, they entered the Palace of Alhambra and took the keys to the city. As the Muslim ruler Boabdil left in tears, it was said that his mother spat out at him, "Do not weep like a woman, for that which you cannot defend like a man."
Isabella's victory in Granada put an end to an incredible society. In the 700 years that they'd been in Europe, the Muslims of Al-Andalus had built a culture which was the very pinnacle of civilized life, influencing Europe in ways that we're only just beginning to understand. And Isabella would endeavour to ensure that Islam in the West would never enjoy such a relationship again.
A few years after Ferdinand and Isabella came to power, they set up an organisation that affected the most extreme form of religious control that Europe has ever known.
The Inquisition.
The purpose of the Inquisition was to track down and eliminate anyone who wasn't an Orthodox member of the Catholic Church.
Those found guilty of heresy were subjected to a sinister public ceremony called an auto de fe. In this eerie ritual, vestiges of which are still performed today, the guilty were forced to repent their sins while their accusers watched on, hidden under hooded caps. The sinners were then detained. Some were burnt at the stake. Most had their homes and livelihoods taken from them. In 1526, the Spanish Inquisition came to Granada to deal with the Muslim problem. Muslims were labelled heretics and given a stark choice: convert to Catholicism, leave the country, or be punished. The Muslims of Granada were segregated from the rest of the population. Their ghetto survives as the old quarter of the city today.
It's a fantastic house. Thank you.
Many of the houses that the Muslims were forced out of are still standing. Antonio Orihuela lives in one.
It's almost inverted, because you don't have any windows looking out onto the street, but the focus is in the middle here on the courtyard.
Yes, the courtyard is the center of the family life. So all the doors and windows are open to the courtyard and close to the street. Privacy was one of the most important characteristics of these houses. Outside the house, they were Christian. They went to the church with the priest. They celebrate the wedding in the Christian way, but then later they came home to celebrate again the wedding in the Muslim style.
What happened though when the Inquisition came knocking on the door?
Well, as you see, these houses had the vent entry. So from outside, even if the door is open, it's not possible to see what happens in the courtyard.
The Inquisitors went from door to door, seeking out those they still suspected of being Muslim. A number of civic leaders had already been expelled, and so often it was only women and children left. They herded them up and held them in churches by night so that they could be tried the following morning. Some of the women cried out that they were like lambs being taken to the slaughter and wished that instead they'd been allowed to die in their own home.
The Inquisition was so brutally efficient that within 20 years, all Muslims in Spain had been forcibly converted to Catholicism. But this wasn't enough. Many still continued to practice their faith in private. And so, in 1609, the Spanish crown ordered the removal of all Muslims from Spain.
Perhaps the most shocking thing in the expulsion is they were not actually expelling Arabs, nor were they expelling Berbers. The huge majority of the people that were being expelled by blood, by DNA, if you will, were as Iberian as their Christian cousins in the north who were kicking them out of the peninsula. It's really it's an enormously different vision of what the expulsions were and what they meant when we realize that the people who were being thrust out were as native to the peninsula as the Christian kings.
Why do you think the Catholic authorities felt they had to expel the Moors in 1609?
The Spanish Empire, for it was indeed by then the Empire, simply felt pressed in so many different directions. They were very much afraid of the Turks, who were in fact raiding from North Africa and raiding along the southern coast of Spain. They were fighting wars still in the Americas. It was one internal problem that they simply could not deal with any longer.
In 10 years, over 250,000 Muslims were expelled from Spain. Forbidden to take any possessions with them, most sought refuge in North Africa.
When Isabella and Ferdinand died, this is where they were buried. It's a little corner of the Alhambra, and it's decorated with inscriptions from the Quran. They read, "There is no true God but Allah." In many ways, it's a curious choice for a Christian entombment, but it does speak of that complicated relationship that was enjoyed by the Catholics and the Muslims. On one level, it says that Isabella and Ferdinand were still half in love with all things Islamic, but on the other, it's a bold and uncompromising statement of control.
And in Cordoba, the new Catholic rulers did something unbelievable. In a daring act of what can only be described as inspired vandalism, architects gouged out the centre of the mosque. In its place, built one of the most spectacular cathedrals in Spain. The result is a shocking and blasphemous conflation of two of the world's most powerful religions. It is unnervingly beautiful, but possesses an underlying schizophrenia, as if a terrible and silent battle is being carried out in the very architecture of the building. Spain's troubled relationship with its Muslim past continued into the 20th century. The dictator Franco invented his own version of his country's heritage.
For Franco, this period was somehow interrupting what was for him a continuum history. He wanted somehow to, if not delete it, he wanted to forget about it. So what he did was to explain the whole Muslim or the whole Al-Andalus as a kind of continuum from the Visigothic period to the Catholic kings, by saying that the Muslims in Al-Andalus were not such big, good Muslims, but much more Christianized. So this is the political use of history. He wanted to explain the identity of being Spaniards.
And for Franco, that identity was a continuation from the Visigothic period right through to the Catholic period.
Yeah, exactly.
Serafin Fanjul is an academic whose books on the history of Al-Andalus are bestsellers in Spain.
Do you think that Spanish people today are proud at all of the Arabic episode in their history, or are they ashamed of it?
No, not at all. Strictly speaking, it's not our past. It's the past of other people. As a modern-day Spaniard, I would feel very little connection with the Arab past. Spanish people don't live like them. We don't dress like them. We don't feel like them. I don't know how you can say we are the same, because we are not the same. We have nothing in common. Nothing in common. And if I weren't a professor of Arabic studies, I would have absolutely no feeling for Muslim culture.
For a very long time, people have protested and urged that history be truthfully told, that they not be fed this nonsense. But this is the inheritance of the Inquisition. The Inquisition's character is alive and well. I can tell you one thing. Spanish people have a tendency to prevent others from speaking their minds, a tendency to try and control the way others behave and think. You can be sure that when you try and speak the truth, you pay for it.
And so Al-Andalus fell. East became East, and West became West. Two distinct cultures, politically and religiously divided. And yet, what the history of the Moors shows is that these two cultures are also linked in ways that we might never have imagined. The West has been inspired by Islam, but more than that, it was in the very act of fighting the Muslims that Europe consolidated its identity.
When we started, Christopher Columbus was setting sail for the New World. And as he pointed his boats westwards, Spain aligned herself with him, turning away from the east. The Muslims had been fought, and now they were to be forgotten. As time went by, memories of the Islamic past were moulded until they became a more comforting storybook version of history. But this is a case where truth really is stranger than fiction. The story of Al-Andalus isn't a simple tale of good versus bad, east versus west. It's intriguing and complicated, it's brilliant and brutal, it's very human and it's very messy. And it's for precisely that reason that it needs to be remembered, not written out of the history books.